Good evening, everyone. My name's John. What I would like to talk about is metaphorical design mechanics. So, just to give us a little context, the last talk I gave, I sort of wrote over the course of 4 months and rehearsed quite a lot. This talk I started writing 36 hours ago, just because I had one of those ideas that went, oh, that's really interesting, I've got time for that. So, it's more of an exploration, but there is some stuff that I've thought about and talked about before, but I've never had a frame of reference for it until I read something on the internet yesterday, which I came across by chance. But that's fine. As James said, some smithery stuff. We help people make things we want rather than make people want things. And essentially, at home, much to the sort of chagrin of my wife, I have lots and lots of packs of cards. And yes, normal playing cards, but also cards like this. This is a reprint of the Eames House of Cards, which they did in 1952, I believe. So a very creative deck of cards with slots on them, so you can build conceptual objects and just explore different patterns and ideas and so on, and make whatever you like. They're just kind of really fun, really relaxing, and quite good to sort of like watch your kids using and just see what they do with them and what connections they make between different things. I also have these, the Writer Emergency Pack. I don't really write anything that needs a Writer Emergency Pack, but it's one of those things that you back on Kickstarter because you go, yes, I want that in the world, that's fine. I have the inability to use a Mac. I have these, I've got lots of these, so my friend Ola in Sweden makes these, makes Method Kit. Lots and lots of practical different toolkits for sort of like when you're working on things like projects or apps or whatever else, just little prompts to sort of nudge you in different directions. I have Stephen Milne's constraint cards, so if you're a coder, you can put them in front of the thing. It just tells you one frame of reference for the way that you've got to work that day. There's probably an oblique strategies klaxon you could put in there. I've got Stephen Anderson's mental notes, which are really, really deep cards and talk about user behavior and just sort of give you prompts to think about people. I've got these lovely near future laboratory cards for designing new artifacts in the world. I've got these cards that I can't remember who gave me them or why they gave me them, and they're from 2011, they're from New South Wales. I don't know anyone from New South Wales. I just found them in my cupboard as I was going through taking pictures of lots of cards that I own. I have the Fine Adaptive Lab cards. You looked up and went, what? You've not got those? I do. The workshop kit designed to help you get from problem to prototype in 48 hours. I've got some cards that my friend and I, James, who you'll see later on in this presentation, designed for Carlsberg. It was called the Awesome Game. So it was a strategic card game to get a company to have at least the same ballpark approximation of the same word awesome, which is quite interesting with Danish people, because sometimes they're very serious and don't like that word. And but the reason I have all these cards is because I make something called artifact cards. And these are various iterations of them, and it's basically so it's something, for the last 3 years I have worked on cards quite a lot when thinking about ideas and using cards with other people. I have fucking drawers of these things. Which is quite good because the IKEA drawers, you know the little metal ones, the long deep ones, they fit the packs beautifully. But I've got lots of those, so all the projects you can go back into and dive back into and sort of like explore all the things that you've done. And in a very meta way, I've even got the cards of this talk, which this talk is now these cards, but turned into something. Are cards a thing? So what I'm going to talk about is, are cards a thing? Why are cards a thing? And why are cards a thing now? In relation to designing things for the interwebs. And I've said interwebs, and I wish I hadn't. But first of all, are cards a thing? I need to take you through, and this was only 36 hours ago, so forgive me, it's a very casually researched history of the playing card. So it's not a book's worth, it's probably factually incorrect in places, but there is enough from page 1 and a little from page 2 of Google to understand about the history of the playing cards. So, the playing card starts in Imperial China in the 9th century. And so this is a picture from 1400, because you don't really get pictures of playing cards from 900 AD, because that's kind of like, that's too old. Paper doesn't really last that long. But it's good for, that's pretty good. It's good for 600 years. And the playing cards emerge in Imperial China in the 9th century, at the same time that they decide this is a bad idea. At the time they decide that sort of like, so they write things on scrolls, big long scrolls of paper, and then they roll them all up, and then they pass them from city to city, they have to unroll them again. The Chinese decide in the 9th century, you know what, this is fucking terrible, because you have to unroll the whole thing, and everything's connect and join. You have to get right down to the bottom to find the bit of information. Why don't we cut these up? Why don't we turn these scrolls into pages? Because then we can actually look through it more efficiently, and just sort of like, if we put it in a book, we can move to the bit of the book that we find that we want to look at, or if we keep them as separate leaves, we can move them around. And so at the same time, something called the leaf game is recorded as happening. So lots of playful things on different pages of paper which they move around, and so that is generally accepted as the first playing card, says the internet. And so out of Chinese culture at that time, you get lots of interesting things. So that's where Mahjong originates from. So you'll have all played Mahjong, and if you're as old as me, you'll have played it on bad Windows computers and Windows 3.1. But it also sort of but it kickstarts the kind of like the playing card thing. So essentially, it does what lots of things done after that. It sort of like made its way up through the trade routes. So into India and Persia and Egypt, and so all through sort of like the next 200-300 years. It travels. It becomes part, in some cases, of commerce itself. So you see some playing card games in which the cards themselves become the thing that you win. So when you take a trick, you win the card, and because the card is worth something, you have won actual money using the thing. And it gets into Europe in the 14th century, and then we start to see lots and lots of different decks, so Spanish decks, Latin decks, Greek decks. But the deck that wins out, and Matthew will be very pleased about this, is the French deck. The French deck wins. 52 cards. It begins to look like the sorts of things that we know about card decks. So kings, queens, which is ironic that the French, haters of kings, sort of like win the card game thing. And then fast forward like 600 years, you get Nintendo as a playing card company. I don't really have anything more to say about that, other than I found it on the internet. And I didn't know that. So there we go. If you learn nothing else, that. And you get very quickly into modern day. So Cards Against Humanity. Suddenly, everything is awash with cards. There's 370 that I can find successfully funded card projects on Kickstarter, and thousands of failed ones. It's a very easy thing to put on Kickstarter, a set of cards. We will put content on cards, make the cards because people make them, and give you these. We get everything from Scrum Poker to all sorts of different ways in which people are making cards and using cards to think about things. It is a long, deep cultural language, which is some of the stuff that by accident we found when we started doing the artifact card stuff was, because originally we didn't think of them as playing cards. We didn't want to do playing card things. We wanted to have something that people would draw a picture on. We wanted to sort of and people weren't drawing in post-it notes, so we said, okay, well, if you give you a thicker thing, like a blank playing card, and a thicker pen, a Sharpie, you'll draw pictures maybe, or you'll be happy to draw, and they did. But then people started doing what people do with playing cards. You put a rectangle with rounded corners in front of them, and they start shuffling and dealing and holding decks together, and then spreading them out again, and then running them in suits and so on. And it just seemed to be some sort of a language thing. And so now you just see people just doing the things, and they don't even know they're doing it, that you do with packs of cards. So I was at a thing last week where various people were in a room playing with things. This is a guy just there shuffling. And he doesn't know he's shuffling. It's not a conscious thing. It's just a sort of like the long, slow culture of cards has permeated everybody. Everybody knows what to do with playing cards. Are cards a thing? Yeah, they probably are a thing. Why are cards a thing? Why are cards more relevant now? Does anyone remember hypercards? Yeah, no, right? So basically, from Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a great source if you're writing a talk in 36 hours. You can just sort of it's like, I know Kung Fu. I know just enough about playing cards to stand in a room and tell people what I've read on Wikipedia. Based on the concept of a stack of virtual cards. So it's like a Rolodex. It's sort of like all these cards have bits of information on it, and we can go to the bit in the Rolodex that we find most relevant. That gives rise to the stuff that David Weinberger, so he's one of the guys that wrote the Clue Train Manifesto, and he talked about how he was in publishing and they sat down and looked at a hyperlink for the first time. And in publishing at that time, it's sort of like basically you decided the order of things. You decided somebody would read A, B, C, D, and E, and so on, etc. You decided that order. They sat and looked at the hyperlink and went, what's that? That is something that lets people go from A to E. Who decides that? They do. We're fucked. The whole idea is that small pussies loosely joined is his unified theory of the web. It's sort of like all of this stuff you can go through in any order that people decide or find or stumble upon or whatever you like. And it's actually, it's this idea that sort of like allowed us to sort of like to think sort of like when we are designing exercises with the cards to sort of like play, right, okay, so how do we get as much energy into the moving round of stuff that we can to make people discover and find and create interesting things? So I will talk to you about two things, synergies and maps. So, what was that? All right. Dearie me. So, synergies. Basically, when you put two things together, okay, you go, whoa, 1, 2, hey, synergy. And I didn't really sort of like, I'd never seen this before until I watched, when I was researching another talk on meta design, a guy called Professor John Wood at Goldsmiths talk about this notion of the creative quartet, where he says, right, okay, if you've got two things, you get one synergy. If you had another pair of things, you'd have two synergies. Well, no, maths magic. You get 6 synergies. Because suddenly, just by doubling the number of things, you actually treble the number of synergies that you can find. And it goes up and up. So with 8 cards, you get 28, and with 12 cards, you get 66, and so on. The exponential relationship means that the more cards you have on the table, the more possible synergies you've got, the more things that you can create. So we use this inadvertently, unknowingly, in a game that we call Popular Thing for Broken Thing. Popular Thing for Broken Thing. Popular Thing for Broken Thing. So Popular Thing for Broken Thing is a way that typically VCs ask startups and they go sort of like, oh yeah, well we're terribly busy and terribly rich. Can you just tell us what sort of thing you are for what market that we know is broken? That'll help us parse what it is you do and whether you're worth investing in. Which is a terrible way to compress all the effort of a startup into one sentence, but it's a really fun way to create new things from scratch. So the idea behind Popular Thing for Broken Thing is we give everyone 4 cards and say, on 2 cards, I want you to write 2 popular things. And the 2 popular things are a service, for instance, that you love and the reason you love it. So I always use Foursquare because no fucker uses it. Which is brilliant. No, seriously, it's brilliant. Because no one uses it, when you visit a city that you don't know, you can use Foursquare to get a really geeky, precise read on a city. And it's not the kind of like the mainstream tourist app, it's just the kind of, it's like, no one uses this, but the 6 people who do have created this brilliant tourist map that I can follow. So, and then you write 2 broken things on the other cards. And broken things could be broken things about life or work or whatever else, or if you're working with specific groups of people, say these things. So think about your company, your market, what is broken for users. And then you get people together in groups of 4, so that you have 8 popular things and 8 broken things. And then you give them a highly generous 10 minutes to make 8 startups. Fine. Popular thing for broken thing, popular thing for broken thing. Keep moving the cards around. Use the synergies to find what goes together, what makes an interesting thing. So we give them a whole 10 minutes for that, which is generous, right? And then we say, right, okay, but don't worry about getting to the end of it, because what you're going to do is you're going to test it out. So we invite them to a networking party, usually outside, where they pitch their new startup idea to someone else who's got a new startup idea. So they get a minute, the other person gets a minute, and then they get a minute to think about it, to reflect and go, right, what would you do differently? What's interesting? What did the other person say was a useful thing? And then they find someone else and pitch it again and pitch it again. And what we've discovered happens is ideas get either A, better, and they get better quickly, because suddenly people go, oh, and you can do this, and you can do this. Or they get worse, and they get really terrible. But they get really terrible quickly, which is actually quite valuable, because what you don't have is a table full of unknown ideas, but you have a really quick read on sort of like, okay, so there is some interesting energy around these 2, and nothing around the other 6. So, synergies, interesting, useful, good. Next thing, maps. So I was reading Dan Dennett's Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking, which is a brilliant book, and it makes you sit down and go, oh fuck, I don't know anything at all. Because it makes you realise that you don't think about the things that you know like this, the XY axis, the Cartesian coordinates. He points out there was a point in history where this did not exist, which blows my fucking mind. You go, but how do you think? I did economics as a degree, so. But just that idea of sort of like stretching things out in 2 dimensions is a tool for thinking. It can be applied to many things. We just use it in sort of like the frame of north, south, east, west. There's a great book called, edited by Hans Ulrich Obrist, in which he invited various people to talk about maps, but show us maps in mapping out different things that weren't traditional kind of like data-led things. So you have everything from Tim Berners-Lee's map of the internet. So we have sort of like green, luscious fields with the World Wide Web and the internet, and down here we've got patent peaks and proprietary paths and so on, and all the nasty things. So conveying lots of interesting information from his read, but in map format, to the very meta, Bruce Sterling's map of what do people who read Bruce Sterling also read. So people who read Bruce Sterling, and they're right in the middle of the map. People who read Bruce Sterling do not read a lot of William Gibson, or that much Neil Stephenson. Not valuable information for this room, mental note. But it's a really simple thing, so just like teasing the cards out and just teasing. But you don't just have to do it with cards, you can do it with anything, but the fact remains, it's just about sort of like having all these different things out in a space in front of you and seeing what's going on. It's even easy enough for a 5-year-old, recently turned 6 yesterday, to do. So I was making a map with cards. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm just making a map for it." "Can we make a map?" "Sure. What do you want to make a map of?" "Toys." "Fine, yes, we can." So we went up to the room and we got all the soft toys out. And we had them all in the middle of the floor. And I said, "Okay, so what makes them different?" And he goes, "Well, some are big and some are small." "Brilliant." There you go, first axis, some are big, some are small. "What else makes them different?" "Oh, well, some like it cold weather and some like hot weather." "Brilliant." Big animal, polar bear, cold. Small animals down here, penguins. I was like, "What can you see now?" And he was like, "Well, all the animals who are small and like cold weather run around really fast to keep warm." That's good, right? So it's kind of like, you go, well, okay, we're learning something new by the relationship, thinking in two-dimensionally, just moving objects apart and seeing what the relationship between them. It's something that we did with some older kids at IED in Barcelona, so myself and Scott, with these other lovely people, ran a course where we got people mapping stuff out in the courtyard, but using themselves, just in sort of like beliefs and views and things, and sort of like, how do you understand the relationship between all the people in this courtyard? Because what we were really trying to do was to get them to read the city of Barcelona and come up with new ways that payment systems might exist in 5 years' time. So it was about going out and collecting information and ideas from round about the city and just teasing out the relationships between these things to map out that sort of stuff. The final thing I'd say about mapping is it's not just the stuff that you can see that's important, it's the stuff that you can't. Does anybody know who Dmitri Mendeleev is? Yes. Who is he? Indeed he is. He's the guy that created, discovered, probably not invented, because probably existed before. He just found it. And the way that he found it is interesting. What he did was he made himself a playing deck of cards. So on each of the individual cards, what he do is write the element that had been discovered, the properties that we knew about it, and its atomic weight. And he had this whole deck of cards, and he used to take very long Russian train journeys, or long train journeys in Russia, whichever way around it should be. And he would play this thing he just called element solitaire. So element solitaire was all about as normal solitaire is, trying to make relationships between all the different cards and just playing with all the different concepts. And eventually discovered that every time you got to like a noble gas, you would start a new row. So you could just go up in atom weight, but the properties of it meant that you would be able to map things out and build a periodic table. So periodically you would start a new row. And what's most interesting about this is not just the places that he put things, it was the spaces he discovered. So suddenly it would come across him and go, well, theoretically speaking, we should have a light reactive metal here of an atomic weight of about this, but we don't. And that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it just means we haven't discovered it yet. So when he published his table, he also stated there should be 5 different elements with the properties and the atomic weights that they should be able to discover. And they discovered 3 of them before he died, which probably made him insufferably smug. I've discovered some other. But again, moving things around, spotting spaces, spotting blanks, those things. We have talked about, in summary, are cards a thing? Why are cards a thing? To finish off, I'm just going to talk about why are cards a thing now. So there's something about not just in the evolution of the internet stuff, but this switch into the next stage of the internet. So I was in the pub earlier, with my friend Scott, who's a futurist, and James, who's a game designer, and we were just talking about cards. Why are cards a thing now? And so here, there are some reckons. So James's reckon is that it's because of Pokemon. Because we are now a generation of people who have grown up into work. There's lots of nodding going on. I might call James, your reckon is right. But it's just sort of like, this is by far the most successful card product of all time. People had sort of like stacks and stacks and stacks of this stuff. And so it's a sort of like a natural behaviour that this has followed people through into the workforce. So there is an even bigger cultural shift in there. Scott's reckon is it is the ultimate way to kind of like to parse with deep, complex knowledge. So it is a sort of like, it's the library card catalogue writ large. Cards are the only way in which we can begin to parse this much data. My own personal reckon is it's this. It's back to that long scrolling sheet. Because we have moved into formats where that long scrolling internet thing isn't as convenient, we go, how do we take all this complex information? We call them cards, Google or Twitter, whatever else. The card mechanic for how we're designing stuff is, it's metaphorical, but it's also real because we're thinking about the mechanics of it. So Paul Adams at Intercom wrote this piece a while ago on why cards are the future of the web. We are currently witnessing a re-architecture of the web away from pages and destinations towards completely personalized experience built on an aggregation of many individual pieces of content. A hand of cards is an aggregation of many individual pieces of content. It's pulling that stuff out and understand this is what you've been dealt. This is the thing that you've got to do. It's the mechanics of that I'm really interested in. If we define mechanics, again, Wikipedia, it's the perfect 36-hour talk resource. The behaviour of physical bodies subjected to forces of displacements and subsequent effects of bodies on their environment. Basically, what happens to things when things happen to them? The mechanics in card world, dealing, shuffling, ordering, stacking, turn, spread. When one thing moves, it affects all the other things around it. It's not the content of cards that's interesting, it's the mechanics, the fact that they are cards, the fact that they do move around and affect all this other stuff. We have, if we were just parsing that Wikipedia definition, we've almost got a content mechanics here, the behaviour of content when subjected to data forces or displacements, the subsequent effects of content on their environment. Basically, what happens to things when we're designing them when things happen to them? What moves, what shifts? If we are designing with cards, when we're trying to design with this internet card system, etc., what we're trying to do is replicate the useful mechanics through the actual metaphor we use when designing things. Possibly, maybe, it's 36 hours old. I'd like to talk to you afterwards about it, and I've put some stuff up there as well.